Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor Daniel Estrada, and this will be the lecture video for Lesson 3 on Ethics and Consequences. As always, these lecture videos introduce the readings and the lesson theme. You can see all these readings, including the slides, on the course website at canvas.njit.edu. On that website you'll see all the course material, which here's another list of that material. As I said, the lesson theme this time is on consequences. We'll be introducing the Ford-Pinto case, and this is a case study we will be looking at for the next few lessons. So we'll just be going over some of the details this time. We'll also look at the Mark Dowie article from 1977 that sort of broke the controversy in Mother Jones magazine. And we'll be looking at the Ford-Pinto through the lens of consequentialism, which is the first of the major ethical theories that we'll be looking at. In order to get a handle on consequentialism, we're going to look at the trolley problem, which you might have seen before. It's sort of become a meme. And we'll look at some applications of the trolley problem, including the moral machine experiment that MIT recently did that's somewhat controversial. We'll look at some of the reasons why the moral machine experiment is maybe not the best thing in the world. We'll also think about the ethics of working in large corporations, maybe corporations that don't do great things, like the tobacco industry. All right, so consequentialism, very generally understood, is the ethical theory that says that we should evaluate actions in terms of their consequences, in terms of what happens as a result of those actions. Consequentialism thinks that it's the results of actions that matter most, not the action itself or maybe the intention behind the action. Consequentialists might say that the road to hell is paved with bad intentions or good intentions. Right? The idea is that it's not the intentions that matter; it's what actually happens as a result. What are the actual consequences? So you shouldn't be scared off by the ism at the end of consequentialism. This isn't like a religious belief. It's not the kind of thing that you have to hold dogmatically or that you have to hold at the exclusion of other kinds of ethical theories. You should really just think about consequentialism as a way of reasoning about our decisions, or way of reasoning about ethical value. And this is a very general and widely applied ethical theory. You've probably used it before yourself. If you've ever done any kind of cost-benefit analysis or weighed the pros or cons of various decisions to make, any kind of weighing alternatives like this might be an example of consequentialism. For instance, if you when you applied to NJIT, maybe you applied to a few other schools also, and perhaps you made a list of the different schools you applied to and the benefits and costs of going to one school versus another. You know, the one school is maybe more expensive, and another school would have a longer commute time. Right. So these kinds of cost and benefit analysis, when you're weighing the consequences, when you're weighing the actual impact of some decision on your life, this is a kind of consequentialist reasoning in a very general sense. So we use this kind of reasoning all the time. It's very common, and we're going to think a little bit about the implications of this way of thinking about ethics, and maybe some things that happen as a result of this way of thinking about ethics. As I said earlier, this will be the first of the three big ethical theories that we're going to go over in this class. In Lesson 3, we're going to talk about consequentialism. In Lesson 5, we're going to talk about deontology, which is maybe the other big ethical theory that philosophers and ethicists refer to a lot. Deontology is a fancy way of saying obligation or duty, like you have a duty to do something or an obligation to do something. So deontologists tend to emphasize your obligations over the consequences, and consequentialism obviously emphasizes consequences over obligations. And these two views, they largely agree about ethics, but they disagree about the way to reason about ethics, and that means that there's some particular cases where they also disagree, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that in Lesson 5. And then Lesson 6, we'll introduce virtue ethics, which is the third major ethical theory, maybe the oldest of these three. My little scheme for memorizing the difference here, or a mnemonic for understanding the difference, is that consequentialism emphasizes that we do what's right. That we do what's good. Deontology emphasizes that we do what's right in terms of obligations, and virtue ethics emphasizes that we do what's best in terms of the overall good. So we'll go through this more in coming lessons. We haven't introduced really those other theories yet, and we haven't really thoroughly introduced consequentialism. So far, we've only been talking about consequentialism in a very general sense, any kind of weighing the consequences counts as a version of consequentialism. And there's lots of versions, there's variations, different schools of thought within consequentialism, broadly construed. We might think of the very generic kind of consequentialism as just the view that you should do more good than bad. You should have better outcomes than worse outcomes. It seems pretty straightforward, but this might manifest in different ways. For instance, one version of consequentialism, which we'll see a lot in, especially in these business ethics cases, is the profit motive. So a corporation, for instance, might act on the premise that it ought to turn a profit, or it ought to maximize its profits, or it ought to make as most money as possible. So if you're making decisions on the basis of what would make you the most money, that's a version of consequentialism. And all these versions of consequentialism, they'll differ in terms of what they identify as good or bad, right and wrong. Also, how they pick out the important consequences to consider. Right. So the profit motive version of consequentialism only considers how it affects our financial circumstances. Right. Do whatever makes you the most money. Don't do whatever costs the most money. And other considerations, like what hurts people or not, what's good for the environment, right? Those sorts of considerations are not considered in this sort of narrow profit motive version of consequentialism. Laser focus on profit is one kind of consequentialism. Another is laser focus on self-interest, or what's sometimes called ethical egoism. So ethical egoism is another version of consequentialism, but it's not the version that says you should make as most money as possible, but instead it's the version that says that you should act in your own self-interest, you should do whatever best for you. Maybe sometimes that means making the most money, but maybe money isn't everything. Maybe sometimes, for instance, you could save your reputation by not doing the thing that'll make you the most money. Maybe you'll lose credibility if you do the thing that just makes money, and you have to do other things for the sake of your reputation, for the sake of your career opportunities, and so on. So the ethical egoist says that not that you should always act to maximize profit, but that you should always act to maximize your own interests, whatever that requires. So this is another version of consequentialism. You might think that ethics requires not just thinking about your own interests, but about thinking about the interests of others, in which case ethical egoism would ignore a lot of things that we might consider ethical, because it's only interested in these particular consequences of self-interest. Radical environmentalism might be another version of consequentialism. Someone who thinks that they will do anything it takes to save the environment, even if that requires, for instance, chaining themselves to a tree that's about to be cut down, putting themselves in harm's way. Right. So this is someone who might sacrifice their own self-interest for the sake of the environment. But so the ethical egoist and the radical environmentalist might disagree about what the right thing to do is, but they both share this way of reasoning in terms of consequences, that what matters is the outcomes of these actions. Maybe the harshest version of consequentialism is sometimes called Machiavellianism, after Machiavelli. Machiavelli's De Prince, where he says the ends justify the means. And he argues that sometimes we should take extreme actions if the outcome is good enough. Right? So sometimes maybe you have to do terrible things if it's necessary. So these are like the ticking time bomb situations. If there's a bomb that goes off and you have to torture someone in order to prevent that bomb, in order to get information about preventing the bomb from going off. Right? So maybe torturing is bad, but maybe torturing is justified in a situation where it prevents a bomb going off in a city. I'm not saying that's the case, but this kind of reasoning is a sort of Machiavellian reasoning, that the ends or the consequences justify whatever actions you take, and maybe even justify what would otherwise be considered immoral actions. So these are all versions of consequentialism. The most popular among ethicists is a version called Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a specific version of consequentialism that says that the thing that we need to do, the kinds of consequences that we need to maximize is happiness. That what matters most is the total amount of happiness. Utilitarians say that we should act in ways that maximize happiness. We should not act in ways that cause unhappiness or suffering. So maybe in some cases turning a profit will also increase happiness, or sort of economic interests and happiness coincide, but maybe sometimes they come apart, and the utilitarian is going to say in those cases you should do what makes what increases the happiness, not what increases profit, or not what increases self-interest. In fact, the utilitarian might even say that in some cases, increasing the general happiness might come at a cost of your own self-interest. Like, for instance, paying taxes. Maybe paying taxes is not something I want to do. I'd rather keep that money for myself. But paying taxes creates social infrastructure, like schools, that increase the general well-being of all the people. So the small cost to my happiness of paying taxes improves the overall happiness of society. It improves it more than it costs me, and so it's the right thing to do. So these are just different versions of consequentialism. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about utilitarianism. But before we do that, I want to say one thing about Machiavellianism, this idea that the ends justify the means. In fact, both Machiavellianism and the profit motive are things that you will see quite often in professional contexts, professional sort of ethics contexts, especially in business ethics. But in politics and other domains and other fields, you'll see examples of people taking sort of Machiavellian reasoning and doing really negative things. Machiavellianism happens to be one of the poles of what's sometimes called the dark triad, the sort of dark, the three negative personality traits or sort of ways of interpersonal relationships that result in a sort of corrosive or toxic a kind of personality or attitude in professional contexts. So Machiavellianism is this ends justify the means reasoning. So people who are extremely manipulative, people who manipulate others without concern for their well-being, sort of cynical disregard for others, exploiting others. Narcissism is another pole of the dark triad. Narcissism is sort of self-importance or grandiosity, someone who's thinks that they're a big deal. And then psychopathy is people who don't care about others, or sort of are disconnected from what are general social concerns. So things like impulsivity, selfishness, remorselessness. So these taken together, when they sort of coincide in a single person, you get the sort of dark triad situations. Someone who's very toxic. The example I have on screen here is former President Lyndon Johnson, who was known for being a close talker. When he was talking with someone, he would get it right up in their face. Lyndon Johnson was a really big guy. He was over 6 feet. And he would talk to people in this very confrontational, aggressive, intimidating way, because it was intimidating, because it would put people, on their back foot. It would make people nervous. Because he's the president, someone talking to you like this, it's a power move. And making this kind of move in a professional setting, it can be effective. It can also lead to a bad workplace environment. So there's all sorts of negative consequences of sort of the dark triad attitude towards interpersonal relationships. And Machiavellianism is one of them. The sort of consequentialist reasoning is a deep part of this thing. But let's go back to utilitarianism. So utilitarianism says that we should maximize the good, we should maximize utility. Utility is just another word for happiness. Do things that make that increase the overall happiness. It's important for the utilitarians that this happiness isn't just a selfish happiness. So you shouldn't just act in ways that increase your happiness, but that you should act in ways that increase the general happiness, so the overall happiness. And the motivation for the utilitarians in putting forward this view is partly to make ethics a little more scientific, a little more empirical, maybe a little bit theoretically rigorous. Mill, one of the important early figures in utilitarianism, wanted ethics to be an empirical, sort of scientific discipline that we can do. We can evaluate certain kinds of decisions in a rigorous way, and he thought that happiness is why everyone does anything, that everyone wants happiness. No one doesn't like happiness. Part of what it means to be happy, part of what happiness is about, is that everyone sort of wants to be in a state of being happy. Right? Even people who are bad, or the narcissist or whatever, they still want to be happy. They just take bad means of getting there. So if everyone wants to be happy, then Mill argues that this is the overall good that we should all work to increase, that ethics amounts to increasing the overall happiness. Importantly, for Mill, happiness isn't just about pleasure. It's not just about like eating the best food and drinking the best wine and so on. For Mill, happiness is, he talks about higher and lower pleasures. So the intellectual pleasures of, for instance, like reading poetry or reading good literature. Mill is going to say that those kinds of pleasures outweigh low pleasures like eating gluttonously, or like heroin. Like maybe heroin causes a certain kind of pleasure, but maybe that's just a sort of animalistic pleasure, and there are higher pleasures like a good education, say, that would make you more happy. And maybe people who don't know or haven't experienced those higher pleasures don't appreciate that they're worth it, and so they sort of get lost in lower pleasures. So Mill says it's better to be the full satisfied. It's better to be human being dissatisfied than the pig satisfied. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than the fool satisfied. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied. So Socrates, someone who's wise and educated. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied, unhappy, than the fool satisfied. So the fool, in some sense, is easier to satisfy because they are ignorant. Exactly what counts as happiness, how we evaluate happiness. Maybe there's things to argue about here. Philosophers have argued about this for a long time. But Mill thinks that once we settle on what happiness is, let's call it a hedon. Let's say that one unit of happiness is a hedon, and then we want to increase the number of hedons around. And that maybe say that everyone, you can standardize the hedon, so everyone has like a distinct unit of pleasure. Maybe eating a sugar cube counts as one hedon, and then like going on a roller coaster ride is 100 hedons, right? And so going on a roller coaster is the equivalent happiness of eating 100 sugar cubes, more or less, so something like that. So that kind of equation doesn't exactly work, but the idea here is that we can start quantifying happiness and using those to make hard decisions. And maybe the most famous case of this sort of quantification is the trolley problem. So the trolley problem, you might have seen these sorts of images before. There's all sorts of variations online. But the trolley problem is a sort of simple thought experiment for thinking through the quantification of happiness and how that matters to the decisions we make. So the idea here, if you haven't heard of this problem before, the idea is that there's a trolley, it's speeding down the tracks, and the brakes are shot, and nothing's going to stop the trolley. It's just barreling along. And it's on tracks that, for some reason, will hit 5 people. So in the image here, the people are tied to the tracks. That makes things a little bit complicated because who put them there? That's sort of an ethical problem also. But in the story, don't imagine anyone put them there. Don't imagine they're tied to the tracks. Just imagine there's 5 people standing on the tracks, and they're sort of not paying attention. They don't see the trolley coming, so they can't get out of the way. And so if nothing happens at all, then that trolley is going to barrel through these tracks and hit those 5 people, and they're all going to die. But you happen to be standing there, observing the trolley barreling, about to hit these people. You see everything that's happening. You understand the situation immediately. And you also happen to be standing next to a lever. And if you pull this lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a sidetrack. It will miss those 5 people, so those 5 people will be saved. But on the sidetrack, there's one person also happen to be standing there not paying attention. And if you pull the lever, then while you save those 5 people, you end up killing this one person. And so the generic trolley problem is, should you pull the lever? And the consequentialist is going to say, well, of course you should pull the lever, because look, the difference here is saving 5 lives versus 1 life, and it's better to save 5 lives. There's more happiness that's created by saving those 5 lives versus the 1 life. The overall happiness of those people and of all the people they know, you will create more overall happiness if these 5 people are saved versus that 1 person. And then we can go through complications and variations of this. So, like, maybe it depends on who these people are. Imagine the 1 person over here is your mother. So now it's these 5 random people. Do you let these 5 random people die and kill your mother, or do you not pull the lever and let those 5 people die? So when you have a special relationship with one of these people, that might change whether you make this decision or not. A lot of people, when looking at the trolley problem, say, well, I'm not going to pull the lever because I don't want to get involved. But you might think that not pulling the lever is also making a decision. If you're able to take the action and you fail to take that action, that's also a way of making a decision. So not pulling the lever makes you culpable, makes you responsible for those 5 people dying. So you're responsible either way, and the question is, do you pull the lever? A lot of people say yes. Maybe some people say no. Maybe it depends on who those people are, if you have some personal relationship to them. Here's another variation. So on the right here, trolley's barreling along, the brakes are shot, it's going to kill these 5 people, same as the first iteration. But in this case, so there's no side track, there's no lever. Instead, there's this bridge, and there happens to be a large man, a man who's heavy, and you, because you're an engineer, you see that he weighs just enough that if you push him onto the tracks, he will stop the trolley just in time to save those 5 people. So the guy will die, but he will have given his life in order to save those 5 people. Now, the guy's not going to do this on his own, but if you just push him, you just need to give a slight push, and he'll fall over that bridge and onto the tracks and save the 5 people. And he'll die. So, do you push the man? Now, in this case, a lot of people, most people maybe, are going to say, no, I don't push the man. You can't push someone onto the tracks. That's bad. But then the consequentialists is going to come back and say, well, what's really the difference here between this case and this case? In both cases, you have one person dying to save 5. What does it matter that you pull a lever versus pushing the man? Like, how does that make an ethical difference? That doesn't make any difference, at least in the way they were telling these stories. It doesn't make any difference into who lives and who dies, how many people live and how many people die. So for the consequentialists, it doesn't seem like it really makes a difference about whether you pull the lever or push the man. And there's lots of other variations of this. You might find your favorite variation of the trolley problem or trolley problem meme to share in the discussion forum. But just to focus in on some of these issues, so one ethical issue that the trolley problem raises, and that's sort of highlighted by this difference between pulling the lever and pushing the man, is what sometimes is called the problem of distance, or the problem of ethical distance, which is just the fact that it seems like we are more responsible for things when we're closer to them, when we're like physically closer to them, right? So the fact that the man is actually kind of far away from the person that dies, I mean, yes, there's a sort of indirect responsibility because the man pushes or pulls the lever, and pulling the lever is what causes the train to divert onto the side track. But that's kind of indirect. It's sort of like one link in a causal chain, and there's sort of several steps to that chain. So maybe the person does not feel as guilty pulling the lever as this person does when they push the man onto the tracks. Maybe the proximity, the actual being up close and pushing, changes the ethical valence, and we're sort of less likely to do it because you're so close. But this is strange that distance matters. Peter Singer in Famine, Affluence, and Morality raises this issue back in the 70s. He says the fact that a person is physically near to us so that we have personal contact with him may make it more likely that we shall assist him, but it doesn't show that we ought to help him rather than another person who happens to be farther away. If we accept any principle of impartiality, universalizability, equality, or whatever, we cannot discriminate against someone merely because he's far away or that we are far away from him. Singer, in this case, is thinking about people who are starving in developing countries around the world, and how easy it would be to give some assistance to those people, but the fact that they're far away means that we tend not to do it. We tend to just ignore the problem. It's sort of easier to ignore because they're far away. And Singer says, well, look, maybe that distance gives us some psychological distance that makes it easier to do, but that doesn't change the ethical situation. It's still a person dying of starvation or whatever. It's still a person dying either way. So what does it matter how close you are to those people that are dying? Like, how does that make an ethical difference? You see the consequences of this kind of issue of distance in something like cyberbullying. Right, so cyberbullying is one of these cases where, it's something that I'm sure everyone's familiar with cyberbullying from school. Cyberbullying, people bullying people online, and it's typically the case that cyberbullying is the sort of thing that you would never say to someone in person. Because if you said it in person, there might be immediate consequences. Someone might punch you in the face. Right? So But you can harass people and bully them online, on Facebook or whatever, and because there's this distance, because you're not right in the same space as the person, because it seems like they're far away, then people are more likely to do it. So this is a well-known psychological effect. It's called the online disinhibition effect, that we're less inhibited when we're online because of this perceived distance between the bully and the person they're bullying. And this matters a lot for engineering, for technology. I mean, it's maybe a little bit obvious here that there's a direct physical contact between you and the person that you're pushing onto the tracks, whereas the mediation here is a technological mediation, that you're not interacting with them directly, but you're sort of indirectly interacting with a machine that's only indirectly connected to them, right? So thinking about technologies and values, thinking about engineering and values, and how creating these technological frameworks creates distance between people, and how that changes sort of the way that we think about people, the way that we think about our own responsibility towards people, the sort of general ethical situation. So that's one thing you might want to think about in this context. Here's another thing to think about with respect to the trolley problem, is the difference between killing and letting die. Maybe to some extent, if you don't pull the lever, maybe you're letting those people die, the 5 people on the main track, but maybe when you pull the lever, you're deliberately killing this person. And philosophers sometimes want to distinguish between killing, like taking an active action that causes someone to die, versus letting die, which is sort of passive, sort of letting it happen. Judith Jarvis Thomson, who wrote the paper on the trolley problem that I'm including in the readings, in that paper she imagines a similar case to the trolley problem. So imagine you're a surgeon, and like you're an expert surgeon, but you have 5 serious trauma cases where you have 5 patients who all need organ transplants, and they all happen to need different organs. Like one person needs new lungs, and one person needs a new heart, and one person needs new kidneys, and so on. So you have 5 patients. Each of the patients need a different organ, and it just so happens that if a 6th person walks in, they're just there for a routine checkup. They're healthy. They're just there for a checkup. But they just happen to be a perfect donor for the 5 patients who are about to die on your operating tables. So if the only way to save these patients is to get a donor now, the only donor that's available is this innocent person who just walked in for a checkup. Now, if the consequentialist reasoning is that it's better to save the 5 than to let the 1 die to save the 5, then it seems like by that same reasoning, you as a surgeon should take the organs out of the healthy person and distribute them among the 5 people who need transplants, because that'll save 5 people at the expense of 1. If we're willing to let 1 person die in order to save 5 here, shouldn't the surgeon also be willing to let 5 people die? Judith Jarvis Thomson says no. She thinks it's pretty obvious that the answer here is no. She says if the surgeon can find no other way of saving his 5 patients, he will now have to let them die, despite the fact that if he now lets them die, he'll have killed them. So despite the fact that you're killing someone, despite the fact that saving these 5 people would require killing the person, you still shouldn't kill the person. You should let these 5 people die and save that 1 person, because there's something wrong about taking the organs from just taking the organs from someone who's alive and healthy. This is maybe also interesting to engineering ethics if you're interested in this killing versus letting die. There's some resources for talking about that also. One more thing about the trolley problem. So, trolley problem has been applied in some contexts. Like I said, it's a fairly popular meme now. And one of the applications of this is the moral machine experiment. This is at MIT. Some researchers at MIT were thinking about, especially self-driving cars and how to make decisions in challenging cases of self-driving cars. And they sort of adapted the trolley problem into this test, this online test. Actually, I can show you what this looks like. Oh no, I shouldn't be up here. Here. So if we go to the Moral Machine website at moralmachine.mit.edu, it sets you up with these pick 1 case, and these are both cases of a car crash that's going to happen. The way that the road is set up, the crash is inevitable, and either the car can keep going straight or it can divert into the side lane. Making this choice one way or the other is going to result in some people dying. And the issue is who dies. And so what the moral machine experiment is it shows you different possibilities of who will die and maybe help you make a decision. So in this case, the car has sudden brake failure. It's going to continue driving through the pedestrian crosswalk. If it does nothing, it will kill 2 pregnant women, 1 elderly man, and a female doctor. If it swerves to the left lane, it will still kill people, but in this case, it will just kill a bunch of cats. 4 cats are in the crosswalk. So do you kill the people or do you kill the cats? I think most people would say you swerve and kill the cats. Okay, so in this case, now it's not people in the crosswalk, but now there are pedestrians. So in this case, if the car goes straight, it'll hit a barrier and it'll kill everyone in the car. And in the car, there are 2 women, 1 man, and 1 boy, a young man. And in the pedestrian crosswalk, if it swerves, there are 2 elderly women and 2 elderly men. So 4 elderly people. And notice also that these pedestrians are crossing the crosswalk illegally. The crosswalk says stop, so they shouldn't be crossing. In both cases here, they should not be crossing. And so the question is, does this car, to avoid hitting these pedestrians, does it keep going forward and hit the barrier and kill everyone in the car, or does it swerve and hit the pedestrians? Right. Notice how there's different properties of the people, like whether they're acting illegally or not, and also like who they are, how old they are. Let's say in this case we kill the jaywalking elderly people. The setup here is that the crash will inevitably happen. There's nothing you can do to stop the crash. The setup, you might already be worried that the setup is already unrealistic. Like, how do you know exactly that everyone will die? Aren't there other options? Like, it's rarely the case that there are no other options. Maybe like a throw on the e-brake and swerve take a hard ride on the wheel or something. Like maybe that'll save the car and all the pedestrians and passengers. But anyway, so here's the third scenario. So in this case, again, it's the car hits the barrier or not. If it swerves, it'll hit the pedestrians who are crossing illegally, and those pedestrians include 1 criminal, 1 female athlete, and 1 female doctor. And in the car is 1 dog and 1 elderly man. So do you save the dog and the elderly man, or do you kill the jaywalking pedestrians who include a criminal, a female athlete, and a doctor? Let's say we kill the car. I'll just do 1 more of these. Okay, so in this case, there's no one in the car, but it has to hit either people in this crosswalk or this crosswalk. Notice these people are crossing illegally. These people are not. What do we see here? So on if the car swerves, there are 2 large women that'll get killed, but they are obeying the law. If it doesn't swerve, there are 2 large men who will be killed, but they are disobeying the law. So let's kill the jaywalking men. Okay, so there are more examples like this. If you find this fun, you might go online and run through some of these examples. Recently, MIT, let me go back to the presentation. So recently, MIT published in Nature a report because they've run this experiment online for a few years now. They've gotten hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of entries about how people would decide one way or the other. And they give a full analysis of this experiment in this paper. Interestingly, they are able to group different regions. So this is it's a website, so people all over the world are taking this these tests and making different decisions, and they're able to group different countries, different regions as being more or less alike. And from this analysis, right? So people in Switzerland and Germany tend to answer these questions very similarly. People in Norway and Denmark tend to answer these questions very similarly. People in Peru and Argentina and Uruguay tend to answer these questions very similarly. And if you group people by group countries by which countries answer similarly, you end up getting this sort of three-part grouping. These are the so-called Western countries. These are what they call the Southern countries, and these are the Eastern countries. And the Southern, Eastern, and Western countries tend to answer these questions in distinctly different ways. So, for instance, Western countries here tend to spare the young, whereas Eastern countries here tend to have no sympathy for the young. Southern countries maybe spare the young even more so than Western countries, but Eastern countries seem to have very little interest in sparing the young, maybe more interest in sparing pedestrians than Western countries. Southern countries show no preference for inaction, whereas Western countries show a marked preference for inaction. So in fact, you have sort of regional differences between how people would answer these questions. In other words, there's no right and wrong answer to who the right person to kill is. I should say that this is in the context of building these self-driving vehicles and how to program these self-driving vehicles. It should be said that there's some choice that we have in how to design these vehicles. There's some choice that we have in designing these vehicles to make certain decisions rather than others. Right? We can build our ethics to some extent into these machines. Right? So how do we build these machines? What ethical decisions do we want them to make? Well, it turns out people disagree on which decisions to make, and there's sort of regional differences. So in the West, people tend to tend to make certain decisions that are different from the decisions of people in the East or people in the South. And these differences show cultural biases or cultural differences. They show especially differences with respect to stereotypes. So this is, I think overall, these are the results overall. So in the chart here on the left, what we see is a preference. So the chart is showing you preferences for choosing the thing on the right. So there's a small preference overall for inaction over action. There's a small preference for sparing pedestrians over passengers. There's a small preference for sparing females over males, or sparing fit people over large people. We didn't see any of these in our examples, but there's also people of higher status, like wealthy people with briefcases, and then there's lower status people or homeless people. The experiment distinguishes explicitly between wealthy people and homeless people. The difference between people who are acting lawfully versus people who are acting unlawfully, between the elderly and the young, we saw some of these examples, that people have a much stronger preference for sparing more people rather than fewer people. So the trolley problem seems to be widely, the sort of generic answer to the trolley problem, you kill one to save five, seems to be the general preference. And people also have a general preference for sparing humans over pets. In fact, you see over here on the right, the order of the things that we would spare versus not spare. So people are most likely, of all the things that you could kill in this thought experiment, or in this experiment, people are least likely to hit the stroller. People are most likely to save the stroller. Excuse me. And then followed by the girl and the boy, with a slight preference for the girl, followed by pregnant women, followed by male doctors and female doctors, and then the athletes. So people are more willing to save the male executive over the large woman. They're more willing to save the large woman over the large man. They're more willing to save homeless people over old men and old women. And the dog, the cat, and the criminal are the worst, with cats being the least likely to be spared. People are more likely to save the life of a criminal than a cat, and they're more likely to save the life of a dog than a criminal. So maybe we shouldn't be modeling our self-driving cars on these decisions. Maybe the ways that people make these decisions aren't the most ethical ways. Like maybe what's really being revealed here are just our systematic biases and prejudices, and maybe there are cultural reasons for having these preferences, and maybe these preferences differ by culture to culture or region to region. But that doesn't mean that any one of these preferences is the ethical preference. You might think that there are no ethical preferences here. Maybe there's no correct way of programming a machine to make these decisions. Maybe the way that MIT is presenting these decisions in the first place is pretty suspicious. I mean, how do we decide who is a large person versus a fit person? What is the boundary between large and not large, or large and athletic? What is the boundary, for that matter, between old and young? You can't always tell if someone's pregnant just by looking at them, or for that matter, you can't always tell if someone's wealthy or homeless by just looking at them, or an athlete. So what is really going on in this kind of experiment is that we're making these sort of snap judgments that are entirely grounded in stereotypes, and these stereotypes are encouraged by the image and the examples that are being given here. Notice quite obviously, this is sort of very obviously, that one thing that's lacking here is racial distinctions, black people versus white people. And because if you ask people to make decisions about who to kill, a black person versus a white person in these vehicle accident trolley problem cases, what you're going to show is that lots of people are very racist. And MIT didn't want to just document how racist people are. But what we do get is a lot of maybe sexism, maybe ageism, maybe classism. And all these prejudices, all these biases are sort of captured in this large-scale decision-making process. The original suggestion here was that if we survey enough people, then we can get a sense of how people make decisions, and we can design our cars to make decisions like people. But maybe people don't make the best decisions here. Maybe this is not the kind of data that we want to use to be making decisions in these vehicles, making snap decisions about the kind of person or like the category that these people fit in order to decide whether or not they should live or die. There's something sort of unsettling about this whole project, and maybe what's unsettling about this is captured a little bit by Abby Everett Jacques in her article "The Moral Machine is a Monster," where she evaluates this study and she raises some of the problems with it. So I'm just going to read a quote from her paper. So the categories of the moral machine that the moral machine is using just aren't suited to capturing social value. Social value isn't calculable anyway, and as noted above, neither social value itself nor the particular features we're hoping to use as proxies for it are the kind of thing you can tell by just looking at someone. There are cancer researchers and artists who dress like homeless people, and serial killers in Savile Row suits. Appearance won't even give you the inadequate categories the machine is using, much less differentiate the business person who is financing microloans to women in the global south from the hedge funder who's just thrown thousands of people out of work on his way to crashing the global economy. Right? So just knowing that someone is wealthy versus not wealthy isn't enough to tell you that they're the ethical person that you want to save versus not. Jacques continues here. Humans are very bad at judging people based on appearances. We are swayed by physical beauty to an appalling degree, for example. But there's no reason to think that autonomous vehicles could do it at all. So thinking about how these kinds of trolley experiments, I mean, I think it's clear why people like the trolley experiments. They're sort of fun to think about. There's a clear like one way or the other. People differ in their answers, and so there's a little bit of sort of controversy, and it's sort of fun to talk about, fun to think about. Maybe it's fun to think about examples of people dying. I find maybe a lot of engineering students are a little bit sort of shocked. Maybe shocked is too strong a word, but they find the trolley problem exciting because it gives you an opportunity to sort of fantasize and imagine different scenarios for killing people and maybe killing different people and so on. And that's not the kind of thing that you can do all the time. So this is the sort of thing the philosophers do all the time, but maybe engineers don't do this all the time. So it's a little opportunity to think about these various scenarios and how you would respond in different ways. But then also thinking, so I think it's clear why people like doing this. I think it's also clear why it gets talked about a lot in ethics, because it's sort of a simple scenario that you can talk a lot about. Hopefully you talk about this in your discussion sections. But I think there's also problems with thinking about the trolley problem. It's a very simplistic way of thinking about ethical decisions. It relies a lot on these stereotypes and sort of knee-jerk reactions that might not be the best grounding for thinking through these ethical dilemmas. All right, so let me go back to the Ford Pinto case and sort of introduce this case as a real-world example of where consequentialism gets applied and how it gets applied and what the results of consequentialism are in a professional context, engineering context. So I want to give two pieces of historical context for the Pinto. Actually, let me start here. The first thing, so the Pinto is a vehicle that is developed and sold in the 70s, in the early 70s, and it's important to remember here that in the early 70s sees a large gas crisis, oil crisis. We've seen similar ones in the last few decades, but in the 70s it was a big gas crisis, long lines at the gas station. Gas was very expensive and it was hard to get. This was partly as a result of an embargo from the oil-producing states in the Middle East. But as a result of all this political and economic conflict over oil, in the 70s there was also a big push for very fuel-efficient cars, and the the places that were producing most of these fuel-efficient cars were in Europe and in Japan. So you have the Datsun from Korea and the Honda and Toyotas from Japan, and then the Beetle. The Beetle was an economy car, very cheap, very popular economy car from Germany. So these efficient, compact cars were something of an economic change from the vehicles from the 50s and earlier that were bigger cars, like sedans with fins. There weren't a lot of economic, like efficiency considerations in the old cars. But that was starting to change, especially with the results of this oil crisis. So lots of cheap cars. Another thing is that the old cars, especially the cars from like the 50s, were also not very safe. So they weren't very efficient and they weren't very safe. I like showing this video of a collision.
That's the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety's front crash of a 2009 Chevrolet Malibu in 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air. In slow motion, you can see the differences in how the new and classic cars perform in this version of the traditional frontal offset test. The Institute conducted this test to commemorate its 50th anniversary, and it dramatically shows how much improvement has been made in passenger protection since the nonprofit organization opened its doors. The two cars collide in an explosion of metal, glass, and plastics. Where the Malibu crumple zone absorbs much of the crash forces ahead of the windshield, the Bel Air structure allows the lighter car to compress the passenger compartment. The impact is made worse for the Bel Air driver by the lack of airbags, head restraint, and even a seat belt. As a result, injuries to the neck, chest, and both legs would be likely. Consequently, the Bel Air receives a poor rating across the board. On the other hand, the modern Malibu provides good protection, with the dummy movement being well controlled. Measures indicate a low risk to most body regions, though a foot injury would be possible. Beyond the safety gear, advancements in vehicle engineering give the Malibu a clear advantage in this matchup. While classic cars are often considered to be rock solid, this 59 demonstrates how much better today's cars are. And the IHS has played a key role in driving these advancements. In the past 50 years, the Institute has made a real impact. The roads.
Okay. So old cars. People like to think of them as like tanks and built out of steel and survive anything, but in fact they're very, very dangerous. People died all the time in these vehicles. There's almost no safety features involved. There's no airbags. If you see the steering wheel column goes right into the crash test dummy's face. So these old cars had no safety features at all. People died quite a lot. Most of the car design was not about efficiency or safety. It was about aesthetics. It was those fins that people liked. It was the chrome dashboard that it looked nice, not that it kept you safe. And the person also mentioned here that these vehicles didn't even have safety belts. So this was a big problem, and in the 50s and 60s, Ralph Nader went around. So this is Ralph Nader from a long time ago. You might remember him. He ran for president a couple of times, and he made his name as a public advocate. And so what that means is that he took issues that were a public safety concern, like the fact there were no seatbelts in cars, and he went to Congress and lobbied Congress to get laws changed, laws passed. He sort of rallied public support around these issues. In the 60s, I believe, Ralph Nader publishes Unsafe at Any Speed, where he talks about how there's no safety features and how many people are dying from these cars as a result of this book, and then Nader going to Congress. Eventually there were seatbelt laws passed federally that cars are now required to have seatbelts. And so there was this sort of push from regulators, from the government, for more safety features. Now, I should say here that cars are generally very unsafe. Not just classic cars, but cars generally. As a statistic, about 36,000 people a year die from vehicle crashes. 36,000 people every year. That's the size of a small town, just wiped out on the roads every year. But the 36,000 people a year who die nowadays from vehicle crashes is at a low point from the highs in the 70s, where there were something like 54,000 people a year. So almost 20,000 more people a year were dying from vehicles. And that was given that there was fewer people on the roads, there were fewer cars on the roads. So if you see this chart, this is a chart of number of people dying over the years. Very early cars, before cars were standardized, they were also very dangerous because there were like no safety regulations at all. You see this big dip around World War II, where a lot of the steel was being used for the war effort, not to make new vehicles, and a lot of the people who were driving vehicles were overseas in the war. So there was less vehicle deaths during World War II. But after World War II, and especially in the 60s and 70s, you see this huge spike in vehicle deaths, and it's because these unsafe cars like that Bel Air without safety features. And then in the 60s, sort of late 60s and early 70s, there were laws passed for safety features, seatbelts, and so on. And you see this sort of steady decline in the total number of deaths. And this steady decline in total number of deaths is more dramatic if you look at it in terms of per billion miles. So the automotive industry measures the safety of these vehicles in terms of billions of miles traveled. So how many vehicle accidents, how many vehicle deaths per billion miles traveled. So the number of miles that we drive every year has rocketed up. We drive way more now than we did 10 or 20 years ago, like significantly more miles driven today than there were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Nevertheless, the number of deaths per billion miles has sort of plummeted. Cars are significantly safer now than they were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. The total number of deaths has gone down, even while the number of miles driven has shot way up. So vehicle deaths, it's still a big problem. Safety features are important, but at the time, because of the oil embargo and the gas crisis, and because of these regulatory pressure to make these cars safe, so this is the environment that the Pinto is introduced in. Pinto is Ford. It's this small hatchback vehicle. This was Ford's first entry into this subcompact genre of car, style of car. So Ford wanted a small, lightweight, fuel-efficient, cheap vehicle. Ford, and in particular Lee Iacocca, who was the CEO of Ford at the time, and Pinto was Lee Iacocca's personal project. It was sometimes called Lee's car. And Lee Iacocca had the policy that he did not want this car to be more than 2,000 pounds or more than $2,000. So it had to be under 2,000 pounds, under $2,000. It had to be lightweight. It had to be cheap. Now, Ford knew that building a cheap car means taking some risks. If you want to be perfectly safe, then you need to get a big, bulky car that takes up some space on the road. And people who are buying these efficiency cars, they're deliberately doing it on a budget, and people who are buying these cars know that they're sacrificing some safety features for the efficiency and for the cost. So people are taking on risk, and Ford thought it could push this risk pretty far. That says danger. That's actually not the. Oops. Uh-oh. Oh, I might have just messed everything up. Let me come over here. Sorry about that. Sorry. Tim's password is not power. Check the slides for the actual password. So Lee Iacocca wanted this car cheap, wanted it efficient, and sort of rushed it through production in order to get there. The way that cars are usually developed is that there's a long process of design and production. Once you design a vehicle, you first make prototypes that you can test, that the engineers can test. And once those prototypes are tested thoroughly, once all the refinements and adjustments are made so you have the car exactly the way you want it, then you put the car into large-scale production. And that process usually takes maybe 3 years, 36 months or so. But because of this financial and economic and political pressure, Ford wanted this car out on the road as soon as possible. So their strategy was to do the testing and prototyping in parallel with the mass production. So they took the design. Some people tested that design while the rest of the factory mass produced these vehicles. And what that meant is that the vehicles were already in wide-scale production. There were already millions of these vehicles that had been produced by the time certain important safety issues were found. So let me go ahead and show this. Yeah, here we go. So this is 35 miles an hour rear-end collision into a Pinto. I don't think there's audio here. Yeah, no audio. Yeah, so vehicle 35 miles an hour, you would get similar effects going as slow as 25 miles an hour, so like residential speeds. But these rear-end collisions into the Pinto would shatter the gas tank, and if there was any sparks from the metal on metal, you get this big fireball. You see these movies from the 70s where cars explode, like they fall off a cliff and explode. And that's because in the 70s, cars really did explode in giant fireballs like this Ford Pinto. Not only would they get covered in gasoline and light on fire, but because the metal was cheap, the sides would crumple in, and so it was basically impossible to open the door once you got heavy impact like this. And the reason for this very unsafe situation is that the gas tank was built right up against the rear bumper. There was nothing in between the gas tank, which is in the back of this hatchback, and the rear bumper, which is just a few inches away. So any rear collision would bend in the rear bumper made of metal, and it would puncture the gas tank and send gasoline flying everywhere and cause this kind of explosion. So the video that you're seeing here is from Ford's testing. They knew about this issue. They were well aware of the issue, but they already had a bunch of vehicles on the road. So there was a dilemma. So what do we do about this? So like I said, Ford knew about this problem. They knew that there was a risk that these cars were unsafe on the road. Not only did they know about the problem, but they also knew about what it would take to fix it. Their engineers, when they were going through this testing, they realized that what would fix it is just putting some kind of metal plate, some barrier on the back of the gas tank, between the gas tank and the rear bumper. So Ford had actually designed the part that would fix the gas tank. They had even patented the part. It would have cost $11 and a couple of pounds of steel to line the rear gas tank with a steel plate that would protect it from at least low-speed collisions, at least those 35-mile-an-hour collisions. The car would still get hit, but it wouldn't puncture. It would be less likely to puncture the gas tank and less likely to cause a big explosion. However, it would have cost $11 to build that part. $11 in $1970, so like $65 today. So less than $100 per vehicle to fix this part. And it would have added a few pounds, but that cost and that weight would have put it over Lee Iacocca's limit of 2,000 pounds, $2,000. When the engineers went to the boss, went to Lee Iacocca, telling them that it was unsafe and that they needed to do something, Iacocca just said his repeated refrain was that safety doesn't sell. That if we make the car safer, it'll also be more expensive and no one would want to buy it. And it would sort of ruin the reason that we have this car, which is to be a cheap, efficient car. So piling on the safety features is not what this car is about. So Lee Iacocca just wouldn't listen to anyone asking to pile on these safety features. And so the cars were just out there. For several years, millions of cars were sold. In 1977, an investigative journalist named Mark Dowie, who wrote for Mother Jones magazine, which is still around today, Mark Dowie found what came to be called the Pinto Memo. Pinto Memo was an internal document in Ford where some of the engineers and the analysts were talking about the risk posed by the Pinto and what it would take to fix. Here on the right here, you see the actual math that they did. So they reasoned that if we went through and put this $11 part on all 12.5 million vehicles that are out on the road, then it would cost $137 million to fix all of these vehicles. Because there are already 12.5 million vehicles on the road, putting $11 part on all of them, is like doing a recall and installing this part, would cost $137 million to fix. On the other hand, Ford reasoned, if instead we don't do anything about the car, and we just accept the risk and realize that some people are probably going to die and they might sue us, and then Ford calculated that, well, so if maybe something like 180 people die from deaths and maybe another 180 burn injuries. And if the court settlements for these cases cost around $200,000 per death and $67,000 per injury, maybe also some money for the car, Ford estimated that those legal proceedings would cost overall around $50 million. And $50 million is less than half of $137 million of actually fixing the cars. So from this calculation, Ford reasoned that it didn't make any sense. It was too costly to fix the cars. It would cost more money than it was worth. So Mark Dowie writes, the cost-benefit analysis argued that Ford should not make an $11 per car improvement that would prevent 180 fiery deaths a year. The memo argues that there's no financial benefit in complying with the proposed safety standards that would admittedly result in fewer auto fires, fewer burn deaths, and fewer burn injuries. One of the engineers from Ford in this article says the company is run by salesmen, not engineers, so their priority is styling, not safety, because safety doesn't sell. Yeah, so this is the Ford Pinto case. As you know, Ford is still a company. Ford is still selling cars. This is a sort of widely known case. It was very controversial when Mark Dowie published this in Mother Jones. It became a big controversy. There were lawsuits. Ford was taken to court. In fact, was taken to court for the first time. It was the first time that a corporation, had been charged with manslaughter, with wrongful death. That Ford was responsible for people that had died. There was one case of a car full of teenage girls that had been rear-ended by a van and it died. There were other cases of people dying from these cases, and they got taken to court, and they were sued for wrongful death, and they beat the case. They were found not guilty in the end. So I encourage you to read about this case, read some of the details, read the Mother Jones article where Mark Dowie exposes this case, and maybe read some of the fallout on the Wikipedia article on the Pinto and some of the other sources I have. It's a very interesting case. We'll be talking more about this in the next couple of weeks. Like I said, next week we're going to be looking at Dennis Joya, who was the field recall coordinator at Ford when the Pinto investigation was ongoing. Dennis Joya was one of the people who decided not to issue a recall, and in the article we'll read next week, he'll say more about why he made that decision. For this, so we're going to be talking more about this. There's lots to talk about here. For this week, the big thing I want to emphasize or just draw attention to is that this is consequentialist reasoning. This is a cost-benefit analysis. Here, Ford is weighing the consequences. It's not utilitarian reasoning, so their interest here is not about what would increase the overall happiness. In fact, it seems like they don't really care about the overall happiness. They're willing to let people die for the sake of a few $1 million. One of the things that Ford argues in the court cases is that they aren't setting these values, so it's not Ford that decided that a death is worth $200,000. These are actually numbers from actuarial tables that were produced by the government. So these are government dollar values. The government thinks that a life is worth $200,000 for insurance purposes, and so that's how Ford was estimating its costs here. Now, it's worth saying that Ford was one of the companies that had been lobbying the government to set up actuarial tables where they could actually put a dollar value on a life. So the fact that these are government numbers is partly the result of Ford lobbying for several years that the government create these numbers. But these are official numbers that say how much a life is worth, how much you have to pay out when you kill someone. And Ford was using that in their decision-making process, meaning that they were willing to sacrifice some lives for the sake of making some money. Right? This is consequentialist reasoning. It's not utilitarian reasoning, but it is profit-motivated consequentialist reasoning. It also looks pretty horrendous. So maybe Ford wasn't found criminally negligent or criminally responsible for the vehicle deaths. One thing that Ford used to argue against their responsibility was the fact that some of the engineers at Ford who were aware of these safety issues had nevertheless bought the vehicle for themselves, for their family. There was one engineer who testified that he had bought the vehicle for his daughter's 16th birthday, even though he knew that there were these safety issues. So if Ford's engineers were willing to put their own family in these vehicles, then maybe Ford was also sort of not so negligent in thinking that other people, in putting these safety risks on other people as well. But what do you think? Is Ford's decision making here ethical? Was it a good decision? Was it justifiable? Does this change your perspective on Ford? When should Ford issue a recall? Right? What is the safety bar that makes something like this unsafe? How would other kinds of consequentialists make this decision? In particular, what would a utilitarian say about Ford's decision? How does Ford's decision, as motivated by the profit motive, how does that compare to a utilitarian in the same situation? How would they make a different decision? What factors go into these decisions? Are these what is the scope of ethical consideration? What is the scope being considered in making these kinds of ethical decisions? Also, what are the consequences to Ford? So maybe Ford didn't lose that lawsuit. Maybe they won the lawsuit. But were there other consequences to Ford's reputation? Maybe Ford's analysis of that cost and benefit, maybe the calculation they did wasn't adequately, it was just using how much a death would cost given their expectation of how those court settlements would work out. But maybe the actual settlements were a lot more. Maybe there are other considerations that Ford wasn't taking into account, like their reputation. If everyone thinks that those cars aren't safe, then maybe no one buys a Ford anymore. Again, Ford is still a company that we're all familiar with. Maybe you even own a Ford car, so it obviously wasn't fatal to their reputation. You might also think about just this principle that Lee Iacocca had, that safety doesn't sell. How our attitudes towards safety have changed since the Ford Pinto. So nowadays, it's basically assumed that we want cars to be as safe as possible, to have high safety ratings, and it's very common that vehicles advertise themselves in virtue of their ratings. A minivan will advertise itself as being an exceptionally safe car with lots of airbags and so on. So maybe safety is more valued today. Maybe that changes how we make these kinds of decisions. Maybe Lee Iacocca's principle here wasn't even appropriate in his time. These are all things to think about. One other, and this is the last thing I'll talk about, this is one of the optional readings, is just making decisions in large corporations. Again, we'll talk about this more next week with Dennis Droya and why he made the decisions he did when he was in Ford. But in general, how does an engineer know when the company that they're working for is doing the right thing or the wrong thing? To what extent are engineers responsible when their companies do something wrong? And this is especially a good question for companies that you might think are defined by some kind of wrongdoing. Maybe military contractors that build weapon systems, or maybe drug and alcohol companies producing pharmaceuticals that people get addicted to, or tobacco producing cigarettes that kills people every year. I mentioned earlier that 36,000 people die every year from vehicle deaths. 36,000 people, that's a lot of people. It's the size of a town. Tobacco deaths still kill over 500,000 people. Over 500,000 people every year die from tobacco-related deaths. Lung cancer. Lung cancer is almost exclusively tobacco-related death. Only cigarette smokers or people affected by cigarette smokers, like waiters in a restaurant that smokes. These are people who get lung cancer and die. The tobacco industry profits off of these cigarettes that are killing people. In fact, they make huge profits hand over fist. What is the ethics of working? So the tobacco industry needs engineers. They need people to make their machines in their factories and their farming equipment. What is the ethics of working with the tobacco industry? What are the obligations that engineers have who are working for these companies, maybe as contractors or maybe as full employees? In general, what are the ethics of having these kinds of industries? And are you willing to work for a tobacco industry? maybe this is the kind of question you might ask yourself: is are there certain industries that you just refuse to work in for ethical reasons? This is a hard decision to make. It's a decision you have to sort of weigh the consequences about, because with these ethically challenging industries, there's also usually financial perks for working there. Like maybe there's an ethical cost to working for the tobacco industry, but maybe they have really good bonuses and they pay you really well, partly because there's all these ethical consequences. And maybe that pay is enough to tempt you to work for the tobacco industry or a military-industrial complex. In engineering ethics, I think a lot of the engineering students who take this class would look at a job with McDonnell Douglas or with Boeing, one of these big military contractors. Like that could be a dream job. That could set you up in your career for the rest of your life. It'd be hard to turn those jobs down. At the same time, those companies are making giant weapon systems that kill lots of people every year. All right, they maybe make the world a less safe place. Or working for the oil industry is causing climate change. What are the ethics of these situations? I'm not saying that you shouldn't work for the oil industry or the military-industrial complex or even the tobacco industry. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but I'm saying that there are ethical issues here, and so how do we decide how those issues work out? I have an article called How Do Tobacco Executives Live With Themselves? This is in 1994 when the big congressional hearings on tobacco happened. This is one of the largest lawsuits ever. Nowadays, everyone knows that tobacco causes cancer. It's sort of well known, well understood. And part of the reason for that is because we see lots of advertisements on TV and so on where people tell us straight up that tobacco causes cancer, that it's dangerous, that it kills you. And so it seems like common sense now. It seems like everyone knows it. But it's worth pointing out here that wasn't always the case. And in fact, for a very long time, cigarettes were pushed as being doctor recommended, that certain brands were healthier than others, or less irritating than others. And for generations, for decades, cigarettes were marketed as even being a healthy alternative, that it was in some ways good for you, that your dentist would recommend it. There was like advertisements and cartoons for cigarettes, so the tobacco industry. In fact, the tobacco industry knew at the time that cigarettes were dangerous, that there were major health consequences from cigarettes, but the tobacco industry repressed the data. They hid the data. They funded counter experiments that were designed to show that cigarettes weren't so unhealthy or that they were healthier than the other research was showing. And they did this specifically to obscure the issue, to confuse people, to make people misunderstand how dangerous, misunderstand the risks, because tobacco industry depends on people being addicted to cigarettes in order to make its profit. So the tobacco industry knew the health risks, denied them, lied to people about these health risks for years, and this all came to a head in the 90s when there was a major congressional review of the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry was found guilty, and they had to pay like $1 billion, some huge amount of money, in damages. And part of the settlement, it was one of the largest settlements of all time, part of the settlement required that the tobacco companies pay for the anti-smoking ads that you see today. So the reason people know that tobacco is dangerous today is because the tobacco industry is telling you all of those anti-tobacco commercials that you see are paid for by the tobacco industry because they're legally required to put those advertisements online. But nevertheless, at the time, they lied, and so here's a quick video of just these congressional hearings. So they were able to get all of the major CEOs of the largest tobacco companies in front of Congress, and they got this little clip of them.
Believes that nicotine is not addictive. I heard virtually all of you touch on it, and just yes or no. Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no, and again, time is short. If you could just I think each of you believe nicotine is not addictive. We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
All right. Dr. Campbell, I assume that you're aware that your testimony, and you said in your testimony that nicotine is not addictive, is contradicted by an overwhelming number of authorities and associations. For example, in 1988, the Surgeon General of the United States wrote an entire report on this topic. The Surgeon General, of course, is the chief health advisor to our government. I assume you have reviewed that report?
Yes, I have, sir.
All right.
Yeah, so all the tobacco executives in front of Congress, just lying to Congress, they know that tobacco is addictive. The medical studies are not controversial here, but nevertheless they're willing to go in front of Congress and lie about it because there's a lot of money at stake. We are seeing very similar things with climate change. A lot of the denial of climate change is driven precisely because there's a lot of money at stake for the oil companies. So people deny that climate change is happening and cause controversy, sort of call into question a lot of scientific reports. And they do this not because there's any good reason to doubt climate change is happening, but because there's a lot of money in delaying and preventing this as long as possible. What the tobacco companies did in the 90s, the energy companies are doing now. This is very typical of the behavior of these large corporations, and we'll see it several times more in this class. I've been talking for a long time, though, and I've put a lot of stuff on the table already. There's lots to talk about here. I appreciate you listening to me, and thank you very much. I'll talk to you next lesson. Bye.